Boa noite, galera! Muito boa noite! Vamos começar aí agora o Forex com vocês. E vamos aí até às 10 horas no Forex. Vamos lá. Vamos ver como é que tá esse ouro aqui, né? Com a fala do Zé Menino. Ele foi até... Caramba. Subiu bem, hein? Pra mim aí... Vamos rolar uma vendinha, tá? Vou fazer uma vendinha aí no ouro. Estão vendido no ouro. Tem que estopar aqui, tá, pessoal? Tem que estopar aqui, ó. 14,96,30. Tá bom? E o alvo... O alvo é aqui, ó. 14,92,55, tá bom? Vamos ver como é que tá o Dow. O Dow bateu lá no 300, que eu falei que tinha venda lá, né? Não, o Dow já tá nas últimas aí já, né, cara? Acho que ele bateu, não bateu não, quase, né? É o seguinte, galera. Vamos comprar o Dow aí. Vamos comprar o Dow. Vou colocar a saída aqui no 300, que ali não passa de jeito nenhum, cara. Sério mesmo. Ó. Bem aí. Tá? E bem aí, pessoal, a gente vai fazer uma venda aí no 305 para ele vir derretendo aí. O ouro, pessoal, a gente vai fazer uma venda com stop aqui. Aí a gente vai buscar um alvo. Esse alvo que a gente vai buscar é aqui, ó. Vamos buscar aqui no 88, tá? Bem, 89, tá bom? 89, 14,89. Beleza? Entendi essa aqui.
Very much for your time today. Heidi, Sherry, to you.
And thank you, Caroline. Hi. Let's now get a quick check of the markets. We are seeing Nikkei futures and Korea Kospi futures higher at the moment. Of course, this coming after the Nikkei suffered its first loss in 8 sessions. We have seen the Japanese yen at that holding pattern ahead of the BOJ policy decision. It's held steady at that 108.84 level for the entire week. And now, when it comes to the Kospi, we have seen 2 sessions of losses. BOK Deputy Governor coming out right now and speaking to reporters saying that the FOMC rate cut actually meets market expectation. The Korean won, of course, has been under pressure after rising to a 4-month high this week on trade optimism. Right, let's now get the first war news with Ritika Gupta. Ritika.
Thanks, Sherry. The Fed has cut again, reducing interest rates by a 1/4 percentage point for the 3rd time this year. But Chairman Jerome Powell signaled a pause in further cuts unless the economic outlook materially changes.
Estamos comprado no Dow e venda no ouro.
Policy is in a good place. Treasuries weakened on the announcement, while stocks and the dollar both showed slight gains.
We see the current stance of monetary
Stop tem que ser aqui no 96, tá, galera?
as long as incoming
E se ele romper aí, ó,
economy remains broadly consistent with
aí vai pra baixo. Vai ficar bom se ele perder o 91.
growth, a strong labor
Vai ficar bom.
and inflation.
Aí ele chega aqui no nosso alvo.
2% objective.
More than 360,000 PG&E customers are still without power in California as strong winds fan more fires. The National Weather Service gave an extreme warning for much of the southern half of the state on Thursday evening, with gusts reaching 130 kilometers per hour. At least 10 large wildfires are burning across the state, but the winds are expected to ease at the weekend. UK Prime Minister Boris Johnson squared off with opposition leader Jeremy Corbyn in their first parliamentary clash of the election campaign. Corbyn accused Johnson of cutting funds for the National Health Service and planning to privatise it. Johnson said Corbyn would deliver an economic catastrophe for Britain and that a second Brexit referendum would ruin what should be a glorious year in 2020.
The time for protest is over, Mr. Speaker. It's time for leadership, and that is what this government provides.
Global news, 24 hours a day on air and at TikTok on Twitter, powered by more than 2,700 journalists and analysts in more than 120 countries. I'm Ritika Gupta. This is Bloomberg. Heidi.
This is Bloomberg.
Ritika, thank you. Let's get more on what we're watching as trading gets underway here in Asia this Thursday. Markets continuing to show signs that all is not well. Equities continuing to rally along with bonds. Bloomberg's global markets editor Adam Hayes, who has. Is there anything that we heard from the Fed that might suggest that this would change anytime soon?
Well, I think the interesting thing, Heidi, is that the bond market still doesn't really believe the idea that this pause is really sustainable over the next 12 months. So there's still a cut at least factored in there. Obviously, that a lot of that's been dialed back, but there still is some movement. So there's a lot of disagreement as to the future path of the US economy, and you can see that with the Fed itself. But of course, the inflation story continues to be something that lurks in the background. This ongoing fear that you do get an inflationary pickup, and that starts to create all sorts of problems, also for equities, of course. So there's still a lot of disagreement. There's a bond market suggesting that further cuts are needed, and Powell doing his utmost to suggest that this is more perhaps what we saw back in the 90s with the 2 Greenspan, 3 cuts and then a hold. So it's an interesting period that may allow some further gains for equities, but certainly nothing you would have
$1.000
to provide material upside into
Bonino.
the year. But of course the big
$1.000
the trade tensions and this cancellation of the meeting.
$1.000.
How soon we can get a date.
Aqui, ó, entra aqui no canal do grupo do WhatsApp. Quem tá entrando aí, ó, tem um grupo do WhatsApp aí do Forex. Entra lá que a gente passa lá os contatos imediatos, né? abrir conta, corretora, como funciona tudo. As operações.
Yeah, so these include Sherry, Goldman Sachs, but also Blue Bay Asset Management, and both of these firms have been in that bullish camp, which has obviously served them well throughout the last few weeks, where we've had a material rally in sterling, and they're really kind of closing those bets now. It's a sense that going into the election, you can't see a huge amount of upside, but nor can you see a huge amount of downside. Is the general message with the December 12 election generally thought to be something that wouldn't provide any kind of upset with any kind of Labour surprise. So you're pretty much sitting over the next few weeks pretty much where we are now. Nothing really to drive sterling further higher, in which case you may see volatility to continue to come down and to see less of the gyrations that we've seen in recent weeks. So a trade that doesn't really warrant much reward at the moment.
All right, Adam, thank you so much for that. Bloomberg's Global Markets editor Adam Haig here in Sydney. And for another look at the charts we've been talking about, you can check them out at GTV Go on the Bloomberg. Sherry.
Right, and Apple shares jumping in late trading after reporting fourth quarter earnings that beat across the board, topping estimates for both last quarter's results and next quarter's forecast. Joining us now for the insight is Wedbush Securities analyst Dan Ives. Dan, great to have you with us. So are investors correct in sort of shrugging off the sales decline that we've seen in iPhones?
Yeah, this is a major step in the right direction. I mean, if you look at iPhone 11 in terms of what's happening in China, right now that's 15 to 20% above expectations. And you see that in terms of guidance as well as in terms of the core numbers. You have services, which is right around the corner right now, but the Rock of Gibraltar continues to be the iPhone. That's stronger than expected. You go back 6 months ago, someone told you have the US-China UFC trade battle, Apple's the poster child, smartphones maturing. You'd think it's stock that is probably 40-50% lower from here. And it just continues to beat our thesis. 900 million iPhones right now worldwide. About a third of them are in window of an upgrade opportunity. That's why the stock's where it is, and we think it's just in the middle innings of a upward cycle.
So how popular have the new iPhones been as well?
They've been, I mean, I'll call it an hour before the World Series, Game 7, a home run. And if you look right now, this is something where not just in the U.S., but in China, if the price cut, $50 price cut, which has been key in China, but in terms of the U.S., right now, from our Asia checks over the last month, we've been tracking about 10% above expectations. Right now, the tea leaves, you could be looking at 200 million units going in 2020, and if that holds, you'll have a stock that has a 3 in front of it.
Dan, the issue is that the easy growth period is over, right? I mean, they have pushed sort of every button, pull every lever to get more sales across more products with more discounts, etc., you know, in more affordable products. But we're reaching saturation in a lot of markets.
And that really continues to be why services is so key. That's the next step in terms of the monetization. But it comes down to the install base. They have a golden install base, and right now you have about 350 million iPhones in the window of an upgrade opportunity, including 60 to 70 million of those in China. So that upgrades the fuel in the engine over the next 12, 18, 24 months. I think where many of the naysayers and many calling fire in a crowd theater on Apple, where they missed it, is in terms of that install base story. And you look at this quarter, this is a crowning achievement for Cook and Cupertino.
Do the efforts when it comes to services, the bundles, you know, there's not that much we know about it yet. They're still sort of working on what combinations. Does it impress you? Do you think it's enough in this market?
Look, in our opinion right now, that has potential to have 100 million subs in the next 3 to 4 years. The bundling was a genius move. The pricing was key. That was a major shot across the bow with Netflix and others. And you have Disney as well as Apple. We think they could disrupt about 10% at a minimum of Netflix install base. Content's missing right now in terms of the platform. I continue to think that it's going to be a step-up process from an organic content as well as acquisitions. We look at Lionsgate, A24, Sony Pictures as potentially real strong candidates for Apple to go after from a content perspective, even though historically acquisitions have not been the core DNA in Cupertino.
Dan, one stock that's falling after hours is Twitter, after they announced that they would actually ban all political advertising globally, how significant would this be?
You look at Twitter right now, I mean, that's kind of been a train wreck in terms of earnings season. You look at Facebook and others have been strong. I mean, they have some heavy lifting ahead. And I think right here, it just shows is this going to be another advertising headwind for Twitter? What engagement looks like? And this is not the news you want to see after what's been a train wreck over the last week.
Yeah, it seems like a reason for selling, right? Because it seems like the business that comes from political ads isn't actually that big for Twitter. But does this set up really, Facebook embracing the ground that it wants to own ahead of the election as being politics, and Twitter stepping back from that?
It's a great point. I think the tale of two cities, right? You look at Facebook, Zuckerberg, and you saw Sheryl before, they're going on the offensive. And I think that's been something you've seen in terms of the numbers, in terms of engagement, monetization. I think they've done a phenomenal job hand-holding within the Beltway in Brussels. And as we go into this political season, I think engagement's going to continue to increase on Facebook. Advertising is continuing to step up. You look at Twitter, I mean, they're starting to hit a stumble where Facebook's accelerating into this next phase of the growth. And I think this is something, look at that, I think this is a major positive for Facebook in terms of the quarter and guidance, while Twitter, I think, is still licking their wounds.
All right, Dan, always great to have you with us. Wedbush Securities Analyst Dan Ives. Australia's Big Four banks facing a messy earnings season ahead. It's been a challenging year, to say the least. We'll tell you what to expect next. This is Bloomberg.
Bora lá, pessoal. Vamos lá, galera.
China's largest banks eked out higher profits in the third quarter, but signaled tougher times ahead. The results came amid a flurry of Chinese earnings from the energy sector to home appliance firms and the airlines. Bloomberg China correspondent Tom Mackenzie joins us from Beijing. Tom, so let's start with the banks. So did the economic slowdown in China have any impact on China's lenders?
Demorou,
Well,
mas
it
ficou.
certainly did, and of course we're talking about an
Cadê esse
economic
celular?
when we're looking at growth of about 6%, but of course that is expected to fall to below 6% next year. It is the weakest growth, of course, we've seen here in China in 3 decades, so that has certainly
Você
had an
carrega
effect.
aqui.
Nonetheless, the biggest
Celular.
banks did post
Pode
profits
ser
in
o
the
seu
third
bicho
quarter
de celular.
of between 3
Oh.
and 6%, so they are still growing, but certainly there's a number of different factors, including, of course, the economic
Botei no
slowdown,
ouvido.
that will likely prove a headwind going forward. Now, Now, in terms of the non-performing loans, because this was a level that ticked up in June, by the way, it's the highest in more than 15 years in terms of the total NPLs for China's biggest banks. They have made some progress on that, so they've managed to clean up, apparently, according to the regulators here, about $200 billion of NPLs in the first 9 months. And the banks are now putting aside more provisions to take into account an expectation that there's going to be more bad debt piling up. So you've seen an increase of about 20% for some of these lenders in terms of provisions. Again, they're under pressure, the banks, to lend to small and medium-sized enterprises. So there is a risk that you're going to get more bad debt further down the line as that pressure from the central government here continues to ensure that there is enough credit for those smaller businesses. So that is where the banks are sitting. They have posted that profit growth, but again, the headwinds are there, and we haven't even mentioned the low
baixa?
which may mean that
baixar aqui, ó.
Aqui não baixa não?
Baixando o celular.
Tom, turning to the energy space, how did China's energy giants manage to fare, given that we've had an environment of weaker crude prices?
Gatinho.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, they've been hit. Both PetroChina and Sinopec have reported third-quarter earnings yesterday. At both ends, downstream and upstream. Because as you rightly point out, of course, oil prices are a major factor, down about 18% in the quarter. So in terms of upstream, they were hit there. Downstream, the refining, this was very problematic for PetroChina, for example. PetroChina, they saw their operating profit from refining and chemicals shrink 82%. They said that's down to a lot of competition in the sector now here in China. Overall, PetroChina's profits for the third quarter fell 58%. Again, downstream and upstream playing into that. Also, another factor for PetroChina is they have to import natural gas and then sell it at a discount because of these government-set prices. That continues to be a drag on their earnings. In terms of Sinopec, they saw profit drop about 33%, again, largely down to the refining side of the business. Longer term, the outlook as oil prices stabilise may look a bit brighter for these energy companies here in China, according to the analysts.
Tom, just quickly, did at least Chinese airlines benefit from weak oil?
Well, that was certainly a consideration, and they don't normally hedge China's airlines, so they may have been better off as a result of this weaker oil. Air China saw its profits rose 4.4% on the year. They say that was helped by investment income and lower credit impairment loss. China Southern, by the way, net income of about 2.4 billion yuan, and that is about 340 million US dollars. They're also, China Southern, looking for additional funding, about $2.4 billion in funding, to buy 31 Airbus and Boeing jetliners for delivery in 2020. The airline sector here continuing to grow.
Our China correspondent Tom McKenzie there in Beijing with a wrap of Chinese earnings. We're turning to Australia now. Bank earnings have kicked off with ANZ seeing its profits stagnate amid headwinds for the nation's big four lenders. Low rates, customer comp, as well as regulatory changes could drag on results this quarter and bring up the prospect of more dividend cuts. Joining us now is our finance reporter Emily Cavan. Shane Elliott really pointed out myriad issues and challenges facing the lenders this year.
Yeah, I think that's a key point, Heidi, that the banks are being squeezed from all sides. You know, there's no single source of good news. You know, there's all these pressures. There's the low rates, which obviously banks around the rest of the world have coped with for years, but are relatively new for the Australian banks. There's the continual cost of cleaning up years in misconduct. Most of the big lenders have told us they've got teams of between 400 and 500 people just working on this issue as well. You know, and then the economy is slowing, so you know there's obviously potentially less demand for credit and stuff, and they're now also going to have to navigate quite what's going on in the housing market, you know, with immense political pressure to pass on cheaper central bank interest rates to customers in full. They're just a bit squeezed really at all ends.
Emily, so what's the outlook at a time when Governor Lowe keeps saying that they will ease further if needed?
I think the outlook is probably more of the same and potentially even a bit worse. So remember, we're talking here full-year earnings. So this is the year just gone. And so the latest round of interest rate cuts won't really have made their way through that much as the results of this so far. So we're going to see the pressure of low rates coming on more and more next year. And, you know, we're going to be going back to sort of grinding out profit rather than, you know, the immense year-on-year increases that we've grown used to over the last decade. Though I do think it is important to say the banks are still immensely profitable. We're not talking, we're certainly not talking earnings falling off a cliff. We're just not talking the bumper crop of previous years.
All right, Emily Kaplan here.
with the latest on those ANZ earnings. You can get a roundup of the stories you need to know to get your day going in the Thursday edition of Daybreak. Bloomberg subscribers go to Dave Go on your terminals. It's also right there on the mobile in the Bloomberg Anywhere app. You can customize those settings so you get the news on the industries and assets that you care about. This is Bloomberg.
$20 dá pra bingar, é? Ai. Não ganha nada não. Um centavo. Zero é danado.
I was actually poor.
No foreplay?
Eat your bag of leaves with a smile on your face.
All the diseases have been taken. I'll take a tax.
In Sydney.
And I'm Sherian in New York. You're watching Daybreak Australia. Boeing CEO Dennis Muilenburg testified before U.S. lawmakers for a second day, once again defending the company and his leadership in the wake of the 787 MAX crashes. Bloomberg's Justin Bachman covers the aviation industry and joins us from Dallas. Justin, Muilenburg was in the hot seat with questions over compensation and families of the victims urging him to step down. What were the main takeaways?
Well, I think the biggest takeaway was that he emerged, maybe not in a positive light, but he got through 2 days without any large bombshell moments, and I think that was probably Boeing's goal for this week in Washington, because they knew going in that this was not going to be an easy time. The lawmakers were angry. There was not going to be a very kind treatment of the company through this process, and so I think his goal was to go through, answer the questions, be forthright, but not cause any further stir or drama for Boeing.
Justin, after the 2 days of testimony, has Boeing committed to making substantive changes when it comes to oversight, for example?
Well, I don't think they made any large commitments through this appearance in Washington, but it's clear, and it's been clear through the entire MAX certification process and the reviews, that big changes are probably coming through how airplanes go through and how they interact with the government and the regulatory oversight. So I think it remains to be seen what will happen, but I think it's fair to say that there will be changes in that process.
In that sense, given how politicized this has been, does this give us any more clarity on whether the FAA will actually allow the 737 MAX to return this year?
Well, that wasn't one of the main things that was addressed, and I thought that was also interesting that nobody had the premise of whether the airplane should fly. It's kind of a given that the plane will return. And Muilenburg has stuck with his forecast that by year's end, the FAA will approve their changes and certify the plane as safe again and airworthy. So I think we're at the point of expecting the plane is going to return. It's just unclear when that does happen.
Does that mean the worst isn't over for Boeing and its share price?
Well, the shares actually rose a little bit from before he spoke, so I think the investment community is relieved that there was nothing that came out of this that looks like it's a showstopper for one of Boeing's premier products. The 737 MAX, just in terms of financials, has to succeed for Boeing because there's so much riding on it, and I think that's where investors were relieved that he got through these 2 days in Washington without anything else coming out.
All right, that was Justin Backman. Thank you so much for the latest on Boeing. Plenty more still ahead in the next hour on Daybreak Asia. We'll discuss how the latest trade headlines and how upcoming China PMI data will play out in the markets with Deutsche Bank's Lina Liu.
Yep, that is almost it for Daybreak Australia this morning. Trading in New Zealand is underway. Australia is set to open over the next couple of minutes or so. Let's get a quick update on how we're faring and what we're expecting. New Zealand at the minute, this is how we're trading. We're seeing upside, or let's just call it flat. The Kiwi dollar trading at 64.08. Sydney futures turning negative now. This despite a record high on Wall Street. Really, the sting out of the cut, if you will, being taken out by comments from the Fed Chair Powell that only serious inflation would put rate hikes back on the table. We also saw the US dollar drop as well, trading at 69 Aussie cents. Well, that is it from Daybreak Australia. We'll get all the action on Daybreak Asia next. This is Bloomberg.
Costco Chip. Gostei desse nome. Xangai. Estatal. Abriu aí, pessoal. Diário. Ficar de olho nesse diário aí, que ele abriu aí. Vai ficar bom daqui uma hora, tá, pessoal? Uma hora fica bom. Que quando abre o mercado asiático. Vai dar uma osciladazinha aí. Que o Fed já falou, né?
Hopes of a handshake in doubt as Chile cancels the APEC summit where the U.S. and China were expected to sign a partial trade deal. And as U.S. stocks hit an all-time high, big beats from big names, Apple, Lyft, and Facebook top earnings estimates. For investors to focus on as the start of trading begins here in Asia. We've got the start of trading in
Sydney just trickling online with that staggered open. New Zealand, where trading has already been underway. Let's take a look at how we're faring. We've got Aussie stocks looking just a little bit weak from the outset. New Zealand also trading.
O Fed até falou do Brasil hoje.
Dollar though has been on the move. We've seen a bit of upside, about 0.3% higher against the greenback after Westpac said that the
RBA taxa, né, do Copom,
from cutting rates, although it still sees the RBA said cutting again in February. Central bank action really is the name of the game as investors in Asia really decipher the meaning of what Fed Chair Powell said overnight. It was a hawkish cut, saying that things will stay hold until there are material changes to the economic outlook, but then in his press conference suggesting that inflation is really key as to whether there would be any hikes, I should say, down the road. That doesn't look likely at the moment. Nikkei futures looking just slightly positive as we go into Bank of Japan decision day, just hours after the Fed cut, of course, and Seoul Kospi futures looking like we'll see a
Se você tem diabetes, por que furar-se? Você pode descarregar o glicose pelo flash de monitoramento de glicose.
This is after a contraction of 1.4% in the month of August, and also it's much higher than estimated. Industrial production year on year also growing 0.4%. The expectation was for a contraction of 1.9%. Of course, we have seen this industrial production slump globally. We are going to get IP numbers out of Japan later in about 50 minutes or so. We are also expecting export numbers out of South Korea on Friday, so do watch out for those. In the meantime, industrial production in South Korea jumping and beating estimates. Let's get the first 4 news with Radhika Gupta. Radhika.
Thanks, Sherry. Of an initial US-China trade deal are in doubt after ongoing protests forced Chile to cancel next month's APEC summit, where the two leaders were expected to sign an agreement. The White House said it will continue to press to finalize the Phase 1 deal in the coming weeks. APEC organizers say they have no plan to hold the event elsewhere. Chile also cancelled the UN climate conference scheduled for December. Israel is setting up a security panel to monitor foreign investments after pressure from the US to scrutinize inflows from China. The move comes after Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu met with US Treasury Secretary Steven Mnuchin. The US had warned Israel that if it didn't take aggressive steps to check foreign investment, it could jeopardize intelligence sharing agreements with Washington. The US Justice Department has struck a record deal with fugitive financier Joe Lowe to recoup almost $1 billion looted from 1MDB. Prosecutors allege Lowe orchestrated the theft of more than $4 billion and used it to pay for a private jet, a super yacht, mansions, and to finance Hollywood movies. The settlement filed in California would be the biggest recovery yet from the Malaysian investment fund. And Bloomberg sources say the board of French carmaker PSA Group has approved a merger with Fiat Chrysler. The tie-up would create one of the world's largest auto manufacturers. We're told the combined entity would be split equally between shareholders and each company. Fiat investors would get a $6 billion dividend, with PSA distributing a €3 billion stake in an auto parts maker to its own shareholders. Global news, 24 hours a day on air and at TikTok on Twitter, powered by more than 2,700 journalists and analysts in more than 120 countries. I'm Radhika Gupta, this is Bloomberg. Heidi?
Very good, thank you. Just some breaking news crossing the Bloomberg. A Japanese cabinet minister is set to resign. That is the second resignation in a week, according to reports from NHK. The Japanese Justice Minister, Kawai, plans to resign, according to NHK. We'll be getting more details on that. That follows on Issue Sugawara's resignation on Friday as well. Sorry, I should say, yes, we are getting some more details on that. All right, the Federal Reserve has signalled a major policy turn could be underway, cutting its key rate for the third time this year as expected, saying it won't do so again unless the economy materially weakens. Bloomberg's global economics and policy editor Kathleen Hayes is here with more. Kathleen, it was interesting because the cut itself seemed like a hawkish cut, but then those comments from Jay Powell set the markets at ease.
Well, I think so. And let's remember, this was pretty much expected because at the September meeting, when the trade war intensified, when there was so much concern about the global economy, we did see the odds for a December cut up around 60, 70, 80%. But today, the Fed started by taking out a key phrase from its policy statement, which is that they would act as appropriate to sustain the expansion, something Powell has said in many speeches. And then Jay Powell, in answer to questions in his prepared testimony, he really made it much, much clearer what the Fed is trying to say.
We see the current stance of monetary policy as likely to remain appropriate, as long as incoming information about the economy remains broadly consistent with our outlook of moderate economic growth, a strong labor market, and inflation near our symmetric 2% objective.
So for sure, the bar is much higher for a rate cut in December. Ruled out only if, well, in fact, maybe ruled out, I should say, unless the economy appreciably weakens, unless the trade war doesn't get a deal and gets even worse. The odds now of a cut are seen down to about, or the chance, I should say, 1 in 5. But I think, on the other hand, the market jumping to this conclusion, Sherry, that the Fed might be thinking about hiking rates. Jay Powell seemed to be saying all the answers to the questions that I think were convincing was when he was saying what would make them cut if the economy changes materially, appreciably. He's not talking about debating inflation rise. He said he doesn't see it. It's much more about a shift away from this economy in a good place to something that isn't quite so good.
Yeah, Kathy, stick around because we want to continue this conversation. Joining us now for insight into this decision is
Gato, vai operar quinta-feira.
And Chief Monetary Economist Robert Eisenbeis in Sarasota, Florida. He has served as the
Pessoal, se essa linha azulzinha aqui pegar ali, ó, na linha pontilhada, vai tirar a gente da jogada.
I think Charlie is pretty much right on. I mean, I was not in favor of the cuts that they did. I didn't think they were necessary. And it's really hard to point to positive impacts that they never necessarily have had. They're just using up potential ammunition in the case we do have a turn down. So I'm not unsympathetic to his
Ganha banana pode?
The more you talk
Sua mãe é
about
botando
things,
você pra comer banana pode?
particularly when
Por que sua mãe faz isso com tudo?
you're creating the concern on people's parts about risk and uncertainty and so on, that just sort of puts people on edge and hence makes them nervous and makes them want to recut. So I think, you know, if I thought he laid out a little bit better today than they have in the past, that they say, look, we've got an economy that's going to grow about 2%, 2.1%.
Mas na Crocs,
And that's the potential for the economy.
vocês
So
vão pra
that's
academia.
what we have. That's not bad. And when you put that together with the labor market situation, the fact that more people are working than ever, they've got a
Vou malhar.
low unemployment rate.
São 8 e 10.
You know, these are
Tchau.
the wages are going up.
Right.
These are all real positive strengths for an economy that's growing at that rate. So, you know, don't fan the flames, I think, is part of what Charlie's message is.
Yeah, Bob,
And I
you
think
said
he's
it, right? I mean, people are getting anxious. This GTV chart on the Bloomberg showing that consumer confidence has now dropped to a 4-month low. So I wonder how in line is soft data against hard data?
Well, you know, I think, to me, when I look for, in this particular case, I look at the NFIB survey, what are small businesses doing, and that's a pretty solid survey yet. I'm more concerned about business investment, the fact that it's been pretty slow. If you look at that GDP number that came out, there's virtually nothing except for exports that are adding to GDP, government spending a little bit, but it's mainly the consumer at this point. And that consumer spending number isn't really consistent with the decline in consumer sentiment that we've seen. Usually you would see spending fall off, and it hasn't fallen off that much.
Bob, does what happens with this first installment of a trade deal between the US and China, whether it gets signed next month, whether it gets sort of kicked down the road for another few months, does that make a meaningful difference to either the Fed's trajectory or what the data looks like in the next few months?
Well, I think that's one of those particular areas that the Fed is going to be watching very, very carefully. And if it gets kicked down the road a little bit, the can gets kicked down the road, then yeah, that's going to be another sort of heightened sort of risk.
So, are we in a position where the Fed now may be on an indefinite hold? Not so much in the front burner, oh boy, what's the Fed going to do? Inflation has been stuck below 2%, and Fed has already said they'd be willing to see it go higher. Economy's doing fine. Could a Fed like that be on hold for a long, long time?
Well, I think that's a possibility, particularly since part of the discussion when people asked Powell whether he thought policy was accommodative, he really said that he thought we had a slightly negative real interest rate. That's a sign of really positive accommodation on the part of policy is concerned. If you look at the Chicago Fed Financial Accommodations Index, it's as accommodative as it's been since the financial crisis. And so I think policy is very accommodative, and if the economy is growing, the real side is performing, and we have the employment situation, we can afford to wait to let inflation pick up, because he was very clear about that too. They did see and thought that inflation will gradually move up towards their target. So wait and see and be there for a long while is a definite high probability event as far as I'm concerned.
Yeah, comfortable Fed. Couple of advisors, Vice Chairman Bob Eisenbach, thank you so much for joining us, as well as our very own Global Economics and Policy Editor, Kathleen Hayes there. Well, still ahead, big tech doesn't disappoint. Apple and Facebook both reporting strong results. We'll be live in San Francisco for more.
But up next, what next for the trade deal? Chile has canceled the APEC summit where Presidents Trump and Xi were supposed to sign a partial trade agreement. This is Bloomberg.
Looking down to Asia's first major market opens this morning. This is how Japanese futures are shaping up on Bank of Japan decision day. Pretty much unchanged when it comes to Nikkei futures trading in Chicago. Of course, the BOJ expected to potentially announce further stimulus measures given the recent weakness in data and also the Fed cutting rates just a few hours ago. This is Daybreak Asia. I'm Heidi Stravlotz in Sydney.
And I'm Sherrian in New York. The U.S. and China have seemed all set to sign a Phase 1 trade deal in a couple of weeks at the APEC summit in Santiago, but now Chile has canceled the meeting due to ongoing protests. So where does that leave the trade deal? Let's cross to Beijing to our China correspondent Tom McKenzie. Tom, so what's next? I mean, this is another hurdle in what was already a difficult ceremony.
Yeah, absolutely. Now, you've had both sides, of course, in the last 2 weeks or so saying that they are making significant progress in terms of this Phase 1 deal, which, of course, involves agricultural purchases, a commitment by China around intellectual property in its currency, and then a commitment from the US to hold off on additional tariffs. Both sides saying that there had been some movement there, but, of course, they were also looking, as you rightly say, to this November 16th, 17th summit, APEC summit in Chile. Now, of course, that's not happening. Now, the announcement seemed to take the White House by surprise. Nonetheless, they are saying, US officials, that they are still targeting a November date to get this deal, this Phase 1 deal signed. We don't have a date, we don't have a location, but we have heard that both teams, in terms of the trade negotiators on China's side and the US side, have been looking at alternative venues. So we'll have to see whether they find anything. And of course, we're hearing from the likes of Jude Blanchette at CSIS saying that, look, this just adds uncertainty. Again, as you were alluding to, if they can't get this Phase 1 deal done, then what happens to Phases 2 and 3? And does this ease the pressure in terms of not having a fixed deadline on the negotiators to actually make real concrete movement to get this thing signed off? And that was something that was pointed out by the likes of Torsten Slock as well, the chief economist at Deutsche Bank, saying this ultimately could mean that we don't get the second and third phases. It just adds that uncertainty for businesses and that risk that you don't get real traction in terms of these trade talks. Nonetheless, I should emphasize US officials are saying they still are looking at this timetable of around November to try and get this deal done. The first stages of it, of course.
Ever important then are the economic tea leaves. China PMI day today. What are we expecting?
Yeah, absolutely. So data at around 9 a.m. local time. The forecast is for manufacturing PMI to come in at 49.8. So the 6th straight month of contraction. That will be in line, by the way, with the September number. Bloomberg Intelligence, though, they think that it's going to be weaker than that consensus forecast. And there's a couple of reasons they point to. First of all, we had the National Day holidays in October. So you had some working days that were taken off the calendar, essentially. That is going to play into the mix. Also, the external environment, according to Bloomberg Intelligence, remains challenging. You see that from the PMIs of the likes of the Eurozone and Japan. So that weakness persists. And then you've got business sentiment domestically, and you can see that from investment numbers and investment data. Business sentiment, particularly amongst small and private enterprises, remains pretty fragile as well. So all of that, according to Bloomberg Intelligence, points to a further contraction for manufacturing PMI. They think it's going to be below that consensus number of 49.8. We'll find out, of course, at 9 a.m. local time. We're also going to get non-manufacturing numbers, non-manufacturing PMI. That is also expected to weaken, but it's still in expansionary territory. You're still looking at a number of about 53.6 for non-manufacturing PMI. But of course, it does all come down to, in terms of the manufacturing side, a lot of it, the headwinds from the trade war as well. And again, our analysts saying that really you're going to see continued pressure on these manufacturing PMIs until there is some kind of resolution in terms of the US-China trade spat.
Right, Tom McKenzie in Beijing, thank you so much for the latest on US-China trade. And we have breaking news. We are now getting the Hong Kong Monetary Authority cutting the base rate to 2%. This is in line with the US Fed cutting its rate for a third straight meeting. Hong Kong dollar is pegged to the US dollar, so Hong Kong essentially importing US monetary policy. We have seen a range of indicators weakening in Hong Kong given the months of protests, but that doesn't necessarily mean that this rate cut would feed into the cost of credit, because we have heard the HKMA say in the past that local banks have their own funding considerations. So the Hong Kong Monetary Authority following the Fed and cutting the base rate to 2%. Coming up next, Boeing CEO Dennis Muilenburg faced more fire from House lawmakers in his second day of testimony. We'll have the latest. This is Bloomberg.
Our top stories this morning in D.C. and
Dow and the S&P. Shall we? So the euro on a 7-day basis.
moves in the currency market, which is down half.
We begin in the oil patch. Saudi Arabia.
Pretty much unchanged.
Welcome to Bloomberg, the first court Asia week.
US and Japan duke it out over exchange rates.
Slumping onshore bond market.
This is Daybreak Asia. I'm Hadi Stradwatts in Sydney.
And I'm Chevrian in New York. The Boeing CEO's second day of testimony before U.S. lawmakers ended with families of the crash victims urging him to quit. Two 737 MAX jets crashed last year, killing 346 people. Bloomberg Sue Keenan has the details. Sue, so what were the main takeaways?
Well, what we saw in the hearing was, first of all, the lawmakers presenting internal memos indicating Boeing had advanced knowledge, at least before the second crash, that there were problems, and again, the presence of the families. Now, in the hearing on yesterday before the Senate, it began with family members holding up the pictures of victims right behind the CEO. And that was a dramatic moment. Again, it happened right before the hearing. At the end of the hearing, which was for the House, today, the family members confronted the CEO directly after his testimony and told him that he should resign. Go back to Iowa is some of the comments that were made. He indicated he respected their concerns, but felt it was his job to own some of the mistakes that had been made and to stay at the helm. The CEO, again, having to answer questions about these internal memos on the MCAS, the flight control system, and admitting once again to the House members that there were mistakes. Let's listen.
We made some mistakes on MCAS, and as we've gone back and taken a look at this, moving from a single sensor to a dual sensor feed is an important part of that. Providing additional training information, which the feedback we've gotten from the pilots, as you noted, is part of that. And then revisiting these decades-long industry standards.
Now, we should note that during the testimony Tuesday before the Senate, the stock did rebound. It was up better than 2.5%, but in this latest testimony, the stock ended slightly lower.
All right, meanwhile, the Sydney Morning Herald is reporting that Qantas Engineers Union is asking the airline to ground its entire fleet of Boeing 737 jets. We had a structural concern with a crack in one of the planes. What's the story there?
Well, according to the report, a second crack has been found, and it's important to note that Boeing initially, when concerns were raised about the two crashes, which were 5 months apart, they had asked that all jets with a certain mileage be checked The Qantas flight is relatively young, and so apparently these checks were not done on a lot of the planes, and there's now a concern from the union that they should be done. A quote from Qantas, a spokesman, was that they would never operate an aircraft unless it was completely safe to do so.
All right, Sue, thank you so much for that. Well, coming up next, Apple posting some sweet results. We'll track the after-hours analysis of the numbers. This is Bloomberg.
Monetary policy is in a good place. We see the current stance of monetary policy as likely to remain appropriate, as long as incoming information about the economy remains broadly consistent with our outlook. We also see the risks to the outlook as perhaps having moved in a positive direction over the course of this intervening period. I think we would need to see a really significant move up in inflation that's persistent before we would consider raising rates to address inflation concerns. Our outlook overall is for moderate growth of around 2%, which is pretty close to trend. That's our outlook. Could be better, could be worse. You never say you've achieved it.
Let's Fed Chair Jerome Powell there after delivering a widely expected third straight rate cut. All right, let's take a look at how markets here in Asia so far are taking in all seen as a hawkish cut, but a dovish commentary from the Fed Chair afterwards. This is how we're seeing trading across markets that are open. We're seeing downside for the broader Aussie market off by about 0.2%. New Zealand trading pretty much flat at the moment. Chicago Nikkei futures have just ticked into the green. This on Bank of Japan decision day. We are expecting perhaps further stimulus to be rolled out by the BOJ, hot on the heels of the Fed's latest easing move. And Kospi futures looking like we'll see a bounce of 0.5% there going into the open. Just a quick look at some of the movers so far in the Sydney session. ANZ, we're kicking off earnings week or the next few days when it comes to the big four earners. We're seeing downside of over 2% for ANZ after profits stagnated. The CEO Shane Elliott really citing myriad challenges from the broader economic slowdown to regulatory concerns for the difficult conditions for trading at the bank. Treasury wine, though, one of the stocks trading to the upside. Australian wine exports to China jumping 18% in the year ended in September. We're also seeing some good gains across oil and energy. AGL Energy there up by over 2%, raised to a hold at Morgan, and also the company saying that it's on track to meet full year 2020
2020 guidance. And finally, Iluka Resources, one of the top gainers on the ASX this morning, the mineral sands miner, saying that's reviewing its dividend policies as well as a potential restructuring or a spin-off by way of a demerger, which could potentially unlock 2 billion Aussie dollars of value for shareholders. That stock up almost 5% in Sydney. Let's get you a first word news check with Ritika Gupta in New York. Ritika.
Thanks, Heidi. UK Prime Minister Boris Johnson squared off with opposition leader Jeremy Corbyn in their first parliamentary clash of the election campaign. Corbyn accused Johnson of cutting funds for the National Health Service and planning to privatise it. Johnson said Corbyn would deliver an economic catastrophe for Britain and that a second Brexit referendum would ruin what should be a glorious year in 2020.
The time for protest is over, Mr. Speaker. It's time for leadership, and that is what this government provides.
Hopes of an initial US-China trade deal are in doubt after ongoing protests forced Chile to cancel next month's APEC summit, where the two leaders were expected to sign an agreement. The White House says it will continue to press to finalize the Phase 1 deal in the coming weeks. APEC organizers say they have no plan to hold the event elsewhere. Chile also cancelled a UN climate conference scheduled for December. More than 360,000 PG&E customers are still without power in California as strong winds fan more fires. The National Weather Service calls an extreme warning for much of the southern half of the state through Thursday evening, with gusts reaching 130 kilometers per hour. At least 10 large wildfires are burning across the state, but the winds are expected to ease at the weekend. Global news, 24 hours a day on air and at TikTok on Twitter, powered by more than 2,700 journalists and analysts in more than 120 countries. I'm Ritika Gupta, this is Bloomberg. Sherry?
Ritika, thank you. Apple shares jumped in late trading after reporting fourth quarter earnings that beat across the board, topping estimates for both last quarter results and next quarter's forecast. Joining us now for the latest is Bloomberg Technologies' Alistair Barr. Alistair, so we did see iPhone sales declining. Why are investors shrugging this off?
Yeah, that's actually a good question. I think expectations earlier this year were so low after the last holiday season when Apple missed sales targets really badly. So this has been a year where Apple is rebuilding confidence, the confidence of Wall Street, and this quarter's results were a perfect example. So the holiday forecast for this holiday period beat expectations by $1 or $2 billion. Wall Street took that as very, very positive, and the shares that were already been rebounding on signs that the latest iPhones have pretty solid demand. But still, if you look at the iPhone business on a revenue basis, it's still down year over year. So that's a real problem for Apple, and they're taking various steps to try and deal with that. But there's nothing getting over it. You know, the smartphone market in general is saturated, and Apple can't really escape that.
Yeah, one of the ways that they were trying to get over that was by raising prices, right, in order to offset the sales decline. So what will the new strategy be then?
Yeah, so this year there's kind of been a reversal with that. The new iPhone 11, when it came out, was $50 cheaper than the previous phone, and it's at $699. That's actually pretty competitive compared to other phones, especially in the US. So that revenue support is really going away, and next year Apple may even bring out a brand new phone that's about $400, which is really almost unheard of for Apple. So the strategy seems to be now that Apple is going for, again, a volume strategy. So next year they're going to try and sell a lot more phones by bringing out a wider range and cheaper devices. And then the goal really from that point onwards is to make sure that the hundreds and hundreds of millions of older iPhones, when those are upgraded, those users don't go to Android phones. They keep them in the ecosystem, and then they sell them more services and other related products like AirPods.
Alistair, what did we hear about the China business, which even without trade tensions and the impact of tariffs, was already having its own set of challenges?
So it's a similar type of pattern really, which is it's still shrinking year over year, but the issues are not quite as acute as they were a year ago. So revenue year over year for Greater China was down about 2%. If you compare that to last year's holiday quarter, that was down 27%, which is a real shock. And on the call, Tim Cook, the CEO, was saying today that the trade tensions are a little bit less, which is great, and that they've had some pretty positive response to some of the products in China. So again, it's still not that good, but it's a lot better than it was a year ago.
All right, Alistair, thank you so much for joining us. Bloomberg Technologies, Alistair Barr there. We're staying with tech, and it looks like continuing regulatory challenges and political criticisms can't stop Facebook. The social network's third quarter sales rose a better than projected 29%. It also added about 35 million new users. Let's bring in Bloomberg Technology reporter Kurt Wagner in San Francisco. Kurt, what did the numbers tell us? I mean, these subscriber numbers, it really goes to some of the criticism that have come from politicians about the dominance and the influence of Facebook globally, doesn't it?
Yeah, it doesn't seem that anything really hurts Facebook these days, right? It's under antitrust investigation by, I think, 4 different groups, and yet here it comes out and has record quarter for sales. And as you mentioned, still 35 million new users on the quarter, including 3 million of those who came from the US and Canada, which a few years ago we started to think maybe Facebook had finally saturated here, and yet here they come out and add 3 million new users, and which is their most valuable market. So it really was kind of a testament to how big of a business they've built, that they can't really be derailed, or even not just derailed, but even hurt by the kinds of drama that they're dealing with outside the company.
Well, in the meantime, Mark Zuckerberg waded into some of the criticism about free speech. How did he perform in those comments?
Well, part of the topical nature of this was that right before Facebook's earnings call, Twitter CEO Jack Dorsey came out and said Twitter's policy now is that they're not going to sell political ads heading into the 2020 election beginning next month. And so, Facebook CEO Mark Zuckerberg kind of had to reply to that without directly replying to that. He repeated a lot of things that we've heard him say the last few weeks, which is that he doesn't think Facebook or any tech company should really be deciding what is true and what is false. He sees political ads as an important part of democracy, an important part of the election process, and he does not want to kind of put restraints on that as Facebook. And so he had to, defend himself, something that, again, he's been doing, but it kind of was heightened because of the fact that right before he went on, Jack Dorsey made his announcement, so it kind of put things into perspective.
Yeah, we actually had the CEO Sheryl Sandberg responding to comments about political ads. Take a listen to what she said.
We're not doing it because of the money. This is less than 1% of our revenue, and the revenue is not worth the controversy. But what Mark said is that we believe in free expression, we believe in political speech, and ads can be an important part of that.
But of course, this is not the only criticism that Facebook is getting, right? We are also seeing criticism from antitrust regulatory authorities as well. We're talking about the FTC, the DOJ, also U.S. attorneys general. So have we seen any impact on that on Facebook so far?
It doesn't appear to have had an impact. I mean, as we mentioned, the business numbers look better than expected. We did see, or I should say hear from Mark Zuckerberg, he talked about the Instagram acquisition today at length, actually, and kind of reflected on what it was like when they acquired Instagram and how they didn't necessarily see that app as a competitor at the time. They saw it as complementary to what they were already doing. And I can't help but feel that he's kind of setting the groundwork here for a broader argument that we're probably going to be hearing over the next year as these antitrust investigations move forward, which is that Facebook actually built Instagram into the Instagram that we know today, and when it acquired that company, it was not the behemoth that we're all familiar with. And so, I would prepare, I would imagine, to hear from Mark and from Sheryl Sandberg about that kind of argument as we move forward into the next year.
All right, Kurt Wagner there in San Francisco with the latest on Facebook. Staying with tech, we are getting final third quarter earnings numbers just crossing the Bloomberg now from Samsung. Samsung third quarter consolidated operating profit coming in at 7.78 trillion won. Third quarter consolidated sales, that number at 62 trillion won. We are looking for, of course, a breakdown across its businesses. We had that optimistic projected sales forecast from Apple, which could suggest that we see better demand for Samsung OLED, that side of the business as well. We have seen shares when it comes to Samsung rising. This is largely on expectations that this terrible downturn in the semi and chip business is about to end broadly across the industry. Of course, we know that prices of DRAM and NAND chips have
stabilized in the third quarter. The commentary is going to be really interesting given that we had a pretty rosy, incredibly rosy beat from the likes of SK Hynix just last week, talking about demand coming from 3G, as well as just a stabilization of chip prices. We're also looking at shipments in the third quarter looking likely stronger from Samsung, and perhaps better than some of its rivals as well. Finally, we are looking for more details on its smartphone business, given that with all the excitement over the Samsung Developer Conference, we saw them debut really the fact that they're sticking to their clamshell, their foldable phone business with that new clamshell design for the next Galaxy Fold. But just some numbers crossing the Bloomberg, that third quarter consolidated operating profit coming in at 7.8 trillion won and consolidated sales number at 62 trillion won from Samsung. So we'll continue to get more details on those final third quarter earnings from Samsung Electronics soon. This is Bloomberg.
I'm Chevrillon in New York.
And I'm Patty Stradwatts in Sydney. Well, in the coming hours, we'll get another sense of how well or unwell the Chinese economy is holding up amidst the slowdown and the trade war. China's October manufacturing PMI data is due for release. Bloomberg Economics, for one, expecting it to fall further into contraction territory below 50. Our next guest is a little bit more optimistic. Linan Liu is a Greater China rates and FX strategist who joins us now from Hong Kong. Linan, great to have you. Let me start by just painting a broader picture for our viewers with this picture, a chart, in fact, of the trade war stress starting to weigh on the manufacturing sector. This is taking a look back over the past 3 years when it comes to services as well as manufacturing PMI and new export orders there in the blue. Do you have expectation that we've seen the bottoming out when it comes to manufacturing? And is it more worrisome that we're starting to see services, that, you know, traditionally stronger pillar in recent months, start to falter as well?
Good morning, Sherry. Thank you for having me. We do expect a rebound in China's PMI in October for two reasons. First, moderating risk of U.S.-China trade war. We know the escalation of U.S.-China trade war has been one of the key risk factors for global growth since the middle of 2018. Growth has slowed down both in the U.S., in China, and perhaps the rest of the world. So now with U.S. and China working together on this so-called phase one deal, we think most likely we will see the deal to be signed before the end of this year. Although not a comprehensive deal, but I think it's already sufficient to boost investment and the consumption confidence. And that's why we are expecting economic activities to pick up correspondingly. Secondly, China's fiscal stimulus has also picked up notably since late Q3, especially in September. So that should also help economic activity, especially infrastructure investment. On top of that, the central bank has cut reserve requirement ratio, 50 basis point in September, one more targeted to medium to smaller banks, collectively releasing about 840 billion of liquidity into the system, and that should also help improving the credit condition of both manufacturing sector and the service sector.
Is it a issue of transmission that we haven't seen too much of an impact from the easing measures so far, or do you think that the BOC, or on the fiscal side, will be essentially forced to do more?
One evidence of improving transmission is actually, if you look at aggregate social financing growth in September, is actually beating expectation. New loan growth was at 1.7 trillion RMB, which was 250 billion above market expectation. So I believe it takes some time. For example, the RR card was only effective in the middle of September, and the next one we have also effective in the middle of November, which expect to release 60 billion renminbi of liquidity. It will take a couple of months for the policy transmission to eventually reach corporate sector, consumer sector. But I think it will take some time because if you look at the statistics, for example, some of the early Q2 data in July, August perhaps primarily reflects the market concern, business sentiment weakening in response to escalation of US-China trade war. So it sort of mixed data, mixed signals from Q3, but I think we'll see more evidence of rebound of economic activities in Q4.
What about the transmission, not only within the Chinese economy, but to the rest of the Asian region? Because this time around, the stimulus, the form of stimulus coming from Beijing policymakers seems to be pretty different from the past.
That's a very good question. In fact, I think this round of policy stimulus, China has considered both the short-term impact but also keeping an eye on the long-term macro leverage risk. We know the overall leverage level in China, absolute level, is still at around 250% of GDP, is quite elevated already. So that in the near term constrained more aggressive credit easing. I don't think there's broad consensus of aggressive fiscal and monetary easing at the policy making bodies. In addition to that, we have also started to see CPI rising. In fact, this is perhaps another risk in the next couple of months with the New Year, the Chinese New Year festival season coming up, primarily driven by pork prices, swine flu. However, I think at least from the September inflation, we are seeing perhaps the pork prices is driving more of a broader pickup of inflation pressure. So we do feel there's a risk of CPI to continue to rise above 3% to perhaps breaking 3.5% or even 4% in the next couple of months, and that in the near term has constrained policy accommodation, especially monetary policy accommodation in the near term. So this time around, I would say China's fiscal and monetary policy is more measured, more targeted in the near term, given the inflationary pressure. Perhaps a fiscal stimulus is the priority relative to monetary easing.
Neil, thank you so much for your time today. Deutsche Bank, Greater China Rates and FX Strategist. Let's turn to Japan because we have breaking news. We're getting the September industrial production numbers coming in at 1.4% growth. This would be the preliminary numbers and really beating estimates. The expectation was for growth of only 0.4%. This is also a reversal from the contraction that we saw month on month in the previous month of 1.2%. Year on year, we are seeing the growth rate at 1.1%. Again, expectation was for a contraction. We had contracted the previous month more than 4%. This time around, year on year, industrial production growing 1.1%. We had seen some signals from corporate plans that we could see an increase in industrial production. This is what we got, especially after those South Korea industrial production numbers have also beat estimates. Pretty interesting picture here, given the industrial slump that we have seen around the world. Let's get more analysis with our Chief North Asia correspondent, Stephen Engel, who's right outside the Bank of Japan right now in Tokyo. Steve, so it's been a conundrum for the BOJ, right? Because they have really previewed that they will be looking at their price trends, the global economic slowdown, and yet as these numbers potentially show, the domestic economy seems to be much more resilient.
Yes and no. I mean, this could be an anomaly as well, because the August numbers were pretty bad, and there's a weak external trade situation, not only because of the China-U.S. trade war, but also the difficulties that Japan has right now with South Korea. Domestically, of course, October 1st, you had the value-added tax, the VAT increase up to 10% on October 1st. That was suspected to, of course, dampen domestic demand. However, there were a lot of government countermeasures put in place, as well as a lot of buying before the October 1st hike in that VAT. So this could be short-lived, but it definitely, well, I don't want to say definitely, because we're in front of the Bank of Japan, you know, we're awaiting the rate decision later today from Haruhiko Kuroda and company. This probably is more ammunition for those to say, hold off right now, we'll keep the status quo. Maybe they'll put in a little bit more language saying that they could ease further down the road. But for right now, most economists expect the BOJ to stand pat, even though, of course, the Fed had that hawkish cut overnight, and, of course, we've had subsequently Hong Kong cut rates as well.
All right, Chief North Asia correspondent Stephen Engel there in Tokyo for us. And Steve will be speaking to a host of Japan experts in our coverage today of the BOJ meeting, including the former Bank of Japan board members Sayuri Shirai and Takahiro Kyuchi, as well as Ed Rogers from Rogers Investment. Stay tuned. This is Bloomberg. on Samsung earnings crossing the Bloomberg over the last couple of minutes or so. Final third quarter earnings beating expectations. This on the back of solid demand for its smartphone business, and this also as displays as well continues to stage a recovery. Displays for the latest iPhone helping to cushion the weaker side of the business, which of course has been memory chips for the last few quarters. Net income coming in at 6.1 trillion won. That's about $5.2 billion for the 3 months ended September. That betters expectations of 5.5 trillion won. That was the average for projections. We're also looking at profits when it comes to the memory industry is starting to improve as well, coming out of that protracted downturn. Estimates are really that pricing for memory chips is starting to turn the quarter in the third quarter. The smartphone business, though, has benefited from Huawei Technologies' problems abroad and also demand for the iPhone 11 at Apple. Sherry.
Yeah, and this coming at a time when we're hearing from South Korea that the semiconductor industry inventory is down 13.7% month on month. So this could be really a U-turn when it comes to that semiconductor industry slump. Coming up on the next hour of Daybreak Asia, Bernstein's Vitaly Umansky joins us to break down results from Melco and other big casino operators. We'll have plenty more coming up. This is Bloomberg.
Vamos lá, galera, abriu o mercado asiático aí. Já. Falta 2 minutos. Estamos vendidos no ouro e comprado no Dow. O link da sala tá aí. Tá aí no chat. Abriu aí o mercado asiático, galera. Vai dar uma oscilada aí. Também zóio de vidro. Aqui, ó, é o seguinte, se começar a cair aqui, ó, e subir aqui, a gente vai virar a mão. Já não tem mais essa venda.
Good evening from Bloomberg's global headquarters in New York. I'm Sherry Yan. Welcome to Daybreak Asia.
Our top stories this Thursday, a boost for Japan's investor sentiment as industrial production beats expectations. We'll see how that may affect the central bank's rate plans. Samsung profit beats estimates as smartphone demand cushions a slide in chips. And hopes of a deal in doubt as Chile cancels the APEC summit where the US and China were expected to sign that partial trade pact.
Let's get started with a quick check of the markets. Of course, Japan, South Korea coming online. Both countries beating estimates on their industrial production numbers this morning. The Nikkei up 0.3%. This after falling for the first time in 8 sessions. They're still in that overbought territory above the 70 level on the 14-day RSI. Now, the Japanese yen strengthening slightly, but actually they've been holding within a range of around 108.80 to 90. This ahead of the BOJ policy decision, where most economists expect the BOJ to stand pat. The 10-year yield fell in the last session. This, of course, after reaching the highest level since June, we are seeing a little bit more pressure ahead of that BOJ policy decision. And of course, after the BOJ also left its bond purchase amount at a regular operation unchanged in the past session. Take a look at what South Korea is doing, because we have seen 2 days of losses for South Korea, rebounding and up 0.5%. Of course, we're watching the Samsung Electronics very closely. It's right now gaining 1.2% after their third quarter net profit beat estimates coming in at 6.11 trillion won. The Korean won has been under pressure, in fact, after rising to four-month highs this week on some trade optimism, but now we're seeing it strengthen again. The ASX 200 being led lower by energy and financials, again falling for the first time in 8 days, while Kiwi stocks down slightly, but the trade barely changed levels all week. Let's now get the post-war news with Radhika Gupta. Radhika.
Thanks, Sherry. Hopes of an initial US-China trade deal are in doubt after ongoing protests forced Chile to cancel next month's APEC summit, where the two leaders are expected to sign an agreement. The White House said it will continue to press to finalize the phase one deal in the coming weeks. APEC organizers say they have no plan to hold the event elsewhere. Chile also cancelled the UN climate conference scheduled for December. Israel is setting up a security panel to monitor foreign investment after pressure from the US to scrutinize inflows from China. The move comes after Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu met with US Treasury Secretary Steven Mnuchin. The US had warned Israel that if it didn't take aggressive steps to check foreign investment, it could jeopardize intelligence sharing agreements with Washington. And Bloomberg sources say the board of French car maker PSA Group has approved a merger with Fiat Chrysler. The tie-up would create one of the world's largest auto manufacturers. We're told the combined entity would be split equally between shareholders of each company. Fiat investors would get a $6 billion dividend, with PSA distributing a €3 billion stake in an auto parts maker to its own shareholders. The US Justice Department has struck a record deal with fugitive financier Joe Lowe to recoup almost $1 billion looted from 1MDB. Prosecutors allege Lowe orchestrated the theft of more than $4 billion and used it to pay for a private jet, a super yacht, mansions, and finance Hollywood movies. The settlement filed in California would be the biggest recovery yet from the Malaysian investment fund. Global news, 24 hours a day on air and at TikTok on Twitter, powered by more than 2,700 journalists and analysts in more than 120 countries. I'm Radhika Gupta. This is Bloomberg. Sherry.
Radhika, thank you. The Federal Reserve has hit the policy pause button, cutting its key rate for the first time this year, for the third time this year, as expected, but saying it won't do so again unless the economy materially weakens. For Global Economics and Policy Editor Kathleen Hayes is here with more. Kathleen, so what does this mean? Could the Fed be on hold for the longest, just indefinitely, basically?
Well, you have to ask yourself, right? Because, you know, the Fed really based, Jay Powell repeated this today, they based these rate cuts on the fact that the U.S. economy was okay, worried about the global economy, worried about trade tensions. And today the Fed did cut the key rate 25 basis points, third time this year. That was expected. The big question is, what will Jay Powell signal about what happens next? And what he seemed to signal is we're going to wait and see. First of all, the policy statement dropped the pledge, quote, to act as appropriate to sustain the economic expansion. And then here's what Jay elaborated on when he talked at the press conference.
We see the current stance of monetary policy as likely to remain appropriate, as long as incoming information about the economy remains broadly consistent with our outlook of moderate economic growth, a strong labor market, and inflation near our symmetric 2% objective.
You know, Powell also said monetary policy is, quote, in a good place to keep the economy growing. Our Bloomberg Eco-Fed team in Washington is running a great story tonight where they're speculating. Is Jay Powell saying that the Fed has finally achieved that elusive soft landing, kind of Goldilocks, economy's not growing too much, not growing too little? Bottom line, the odds of a rate cut in December are down to about 1 in 5. Data will go at you very closely to determine what to decide about what the Fed does next.
All right, Kathleen, thank you so much for that. Our Global Economics and Policy Editor.
Yeah.
Hey, so let's take a look at how markets are reacting to the Fed. Markets live
strategist Mark Cranfield joins us now from Singapore. Mark, great to see you. The cut was described as hawkish, but then the comments seem to take the edge off that. Is that why we're seeing Treasury markets react the way that they are?
Yes, I think that's probably right. I think what investors are pretty happy to have heard is that the Fed may be on hold, but they're certainly not even considering raising interest rates again. They made that very clear when Jerome Powell was speaking. He did say that it would need very serious inflation for the Fed to even consider rates at any time in the future. So that is, it almost gives an...
Vai, derretimento! Menino! Derretimento cerebral! Então, porrada, eu gosto é assim, ó, quando abre o mercado asiático. O pau começa a torar, menino! Vambora! E saco o porrete, moçada! Vambora! Saco o brete! Tô fazendo dinheiro aí, pessoal? Hein? Bora! Fazer um dinheiro aí, rapaz! Aê! Olha o ouro! Só o ouro, menino! É só o ouro! Cadê a galera aí? Hein? Bora! Bora, cambada! Ó, o Dow vai lá no 300. Bota dinheiro no bolso. Pra ser feliz.
Yeah, it's difficult though, right? If you're looking at what potential developments could make the Fed start cutting again, or even potentially start hiking again. You know, we spoke to the former Philly Fed President, Charles Plosser, and he said he doesn't understand if the economy is doing well, why did they go today, right? And does that kind of set a bit of confusion as to what would make them move in the next step?
Well, they made it pretty clear that they're
vai o dar.
And if you look back at the previous times when the Fed has done something of this
Nossa, vai pra cima, tá, pessoal? Direcional aí. O Dow e o dólar e o ouro vai aqui pra baixo, tá?
They've done that now. They've done 325s. That's all into the market. They can now sit back, as Jerome Powell was saying, and then
Estamos com o alvo aí 89.
how things develop. But certainly,
Aqui, ó.
the Fed, really since Ben Bernanke was in charge of the Fed, it is pretty clear that they're very
Vai vir agora não, tá, pessoal?
financial markets, especially.
Pode demorar até
For some reason, US equities
umas 7 horas da manhã aí. Precisa ficar posicionado até esse horário. Beleza? Agora, pessoal, só dirigir aí a barcada.
But it's all pretty steady, and they don't need to do anything for some time.
Of course, today we also get the BOJ.
É só dirigir o barco aí, tá? O menininho foi lá em cima. Já tá querendo voltar. Eu não acredito num negócio desse. Será que foi no mesmo buraco lá, hein? O outro? Ou não, o outro foi mais alto. É agora, é agora, é agora, é agora, é agora. Pessoal, o Dow vai lá no 300, lá em cima, 27.300. Bateu lá, a gente sai, a gente vai fazer uma venda lá. E o ouro vai vir pro 14,89, tá bom? O stop tá bem aqui. O stop tá aí no 14,96, tá? 14,96, 25. Ponto 25. Galera, eu vou nessa aí. Vou dar uma descansada boa aí agora. Meio baqueado. O voo atrasou ontem. Quem não sabe, eu tava viajando aí vendo meu pai. E aí eu cheguei na madrugada de ontem, eram as 4 horas da manhã. Acordei e fui fazer a live aí. E é esse horário aqui, já tô às 11 aqui. Mas aí já tem uns pontos aí pra vocês, tá, pessoal? Vou descansar um pouco e a gente se fala amanhã às 18h50. A gente abre o canal aí, tá bom? E amanhã às 8h40, sala privada aí, mini índice, mini dólar. E aí às 10 horas da manhã, YouTube pra galera aí todinha. Vamos ganhar dinheiro, pessoal. Vamos lá, um abraço a todos aí. Todos fiquem com Deus. E a gente se vê amanhã, tá? O Dow vai bater lá no 300, 27.300, tá? Tá no 27.238, vai subir mais. E o ouro vai cair lá pro 14,89, tá bom? Um abraço aí, pessoal. Fique com Deus, boa noite a todos, tudo de bom. Valeu, tchau, tchau.